Well, they say the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Well, last week, big tech gassed up the car with all of us inside it and started speeding towards humanity's lesser angels. Make no mistake about it. From the multi-platform ban of President Trump to the blacklisting of the conservative platform Parler, what we witnessed from the tech giants was a full-on assault on freedom in America. And anybody using hatred of President Trump to justify it or antiquated notions of the First Amendment to defend it are dangerously out of step with the fights that will help define a 21st century world. Your speech, your data, and who controls it. Now, this past week, we learned with stunning clarity that the protections that have come to define American liberty lack the elasticity necessary to preserve our freedoms in a modern digital age. Because Apple, Google, Twitter, Facebook, and Amazon, these are not your run-of-the-mill private companies. And while it may be difficult to understand how the actions of companies that have been around for less than 3 decades could compromise the freedoms of a republic 243 years strong, when we truly examine the role technology plays in our everyday life, that danger that these big tech oligarchs and their incursion to our American freedoms comes clearly into focus. Now imagine for a moment if fishing were a constitutional right, that all Americans had a right to catch, find, and eat fish wherever they may roam. Now imagine that 80% of all the fishing holes in America were owned by private companies. Imagine that you had to ask these private companies for a license to gain access to the fish, and that they reserved the right to revoke permission at any time for whatever reason they deemed necessary. The obvious question would become, what is the virtue of a constitutional right to fish if the only places where you can exercise that right are not obligated to honor it? Well, that is effectively the moral and ethical quandary thrust upon us by the outrageous overreach of the 5 big tech companies this week. In a world where the overwhelming majority of all business, personal, and political speech is nonverbal digital communication, less than a handful of companies control all the levers of speech with virtual autonomy. Facebook and Twitter control over 80% of the social media marketplace. Apple and Google combined control nearly 80% of the email marketplace. And when companies that monopolize the tools for modern speech can unilaterally decide who has access to communication with the world, freedom of speech is no longer a foundational principle, but a luxury afforded to a select few. And that should terrify everybody. Even if you never liked a single Donald Trump tweet, even if you have never opened a Twitter or Facebook account. Because if they can stop the President of the United States from communicating with his 88 million followers, what is to stop them from targeting a movement that you love or an individual that you support next? Ironically, that's not just my opinion. It's also the opinion of Jack Dorsey, the CEO of Twitter himself, who, in spite of his support of the ban of President Trump, said it set, quote, a dangerous precedent. Free markets are the key to a robust America. But free markets alone cannot rescue an industry ruled by multinational behemoths that are allowed to engage in what appears to be collusive behavior without fear of legal ramifications. Apple and Google together control upwards of 99% of the mobile market. In a world where 80% of all social media engagement occurs on mobile devices, being locked out of the Apple and Google universe makes scaling a business virtually impossible. Conversely, Amazon controls 32% of the server market and generates more revenue than the next 3 largest competitors combined. Without servers, a digital company simply cannot exist. That's just the reality. And so the issue before us is clear. The digital world is no longer an alternative method of communication. It is the primary conduit for communication and increasingly is used as a proxy for the world at large. Big tech has effectively become a utility, a public accommodation, like the electric company, the water bureau, or even our roadways. And in America, no utility company can refuse to provide you with service for engaging in constitutionally protected activities or simply because they don't like you. Now, back in 1938, the first edition of a guidebook called the Negro Motorist Green Book was published. In a society where black motorists were routinely denied service at gas stations, prohibited from staying at hotels, and randomly imprisoned or worse, killed for driving in the wrong community, it served as a guide to help navigate the unwritten rules of oppression in a Jim Crow world. Well, 26 years later, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, guaranteeing an end to discrimination in public accommodations because you shouldn't need to consult a manual to drive safely in a free world. Now, today we face a similar but much different network of vaguely defined social norms regulating behavior where the law simply hasn't caught up to the times. And while it's easy to pretend that those assaults on our freedom won't go any further or will never apply to us and what we care about, it is clear that letting big tech play by their own rules is no longer working. So this is no longer a matter of what big tech is allowed to do by law. It is about what we are prepared to do in response to laws that are woefully out of step with the world in which we currently live. Because if we continue to ignore the warnings, it won't be long before none of us have any rights anymore. And all we'll be left with is a new green book filled with advice and best practices and terms of service we hope keeps us safe.